right. Um, well, I'll start by introducing myself. Hi, I'm Brian Daig. I'm with the University of Vermont Center on Disability and Community Inclusion, and welcoming Alan Kurtz and Nicole LeBlanc. Could you guys introduce yourselves? And our topic today, is supporting employment for people on the autism spectrum. So Alan, why don't you start?
Okay, my name is Alan Kurtz. I'm a former special educator. I worked in adult services in Vermont. I've worked at the Center for Community Inclusion and Disability Studies at the University of Maine for the last 28 years, and worked on a number of projects related to employment, and one on transition for students on the autism spectrum. And I got my PhD in autism education from the University of New Hampshire.
Great, thanks. Nicole?
My name is Nicole LeBlanc. I live in Silver Spring, Maryland. I'm on the autism spectrum. I wear a gazillion hats. I'm the PAL Group Coordinator for National Center of Advancement and Person-Centered Practices, Self-Advocate Advisor, TASH, and I do a number of other little gigs. I'm a policy wonk. Disability employment policy is one of my specialties. I'm the author of the book Disability Employment Policy 101 and Why Employment Matters.
And I wanted to mention, if you're done, are you done, Nicole? I'm sorry.
Yeah, you can go.
Yeah, I just want to mention I have a brother on the autism spectrum, lives in Pennsylvania.
Thank you, and thank you both. You did an excellent training for us on supporting employment. But before we get into the questions, I just wanted you to address the issue of sort of identity and labels, because that's kind of been changing over the years of, we always used to use, the person first language and say, some, person with autism, but that's been changing more recently. So could you address that before we get started?
Well, let's see, the autism world, has, some parts of the autism world have embraced, identity first language, cultural identity, autistic person, ASPE. Then of course you got the, high functioning, low functioning.
Yeah. And I think it's been kind of controversial, and I think
especially when you look at the words like high functioning, low functioning, that terms are actually more harmful than they are, because they're basically terms used to deny people with autism who have higher IQ support services. I think and studies have shown people that get the label low functioning, in some cases, they have better adaptive functioning than people that are high functioning, who often have poor adaptive functioning and greater mental health issues.
I think, specifically what you were addressing, Brian, is there's a tendency within the neurodiversity community to use identity first language and say, I'm autistic, or, I have an autistic brother. And there are others who are sticking with the person first language and saying, I'm a person on the autism spectrum, or I have a friend who's on the autism spectrum. And I sort of go back and forth with it. And I know I in most cases, I think, I leave it up to the individual. How do you want to be referred to?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've noticed lately it seems more kind of similar to the deaf culture, how they look at being deaf or hard of hearing as part of their culture and language and part of who they are, and they don't see that as a disability. And it seems similar that a lot of folks in the autistic community are kind of adopting that philosophy as well. Would you agree with that, Nicole?
Yeah, somewhat.
Yeah, talk more.
Somewhat, particularly, and I think a good chunk of that is some of it, the people that are away from, the IDD, who don't have the IDD label. There's many people out there with autism that have doctorate degrees, PhDs.
Great, thank you. So we want to talk about employment. Employment's really crucial for everybody, and we're all in the field of helping people with disabilities to find employment. So what in each of your opinions is the most important thing for people to know about supporting employment for people on the autism spectrum?
Customer-focused job development, develop and carve jobs based on strength. Particularly, don't just stick people in any job. Like, one thing people, especially in jobs that have higher social skills and they're more likely to require, customer service skills. That's, for example, one area that people with autism can often struggle in. Figure out ways to, get people informational interviews, job carving the job to fit the person, not the other way around.
Good. Thanks, Nicole.
Providing long-term job coaching, something that the VR system doesn't really do much of.
For me,
beyond 90 days to succeed in employment when it comes to support.
For me, I think the most important thing is that employers, I think support agencies need to realize that people with ASD can be really valuable employees, that they tend to bring a lot of characteristics to a job that can be really valuable to an employer. A lot of people on the autism spectrum are very methodical and conscientious in carrying out their job duties. They often perform work of very high quality. People are often very dependable, they're punctual, and tend to be very consistent in the way they work. So I think, it's really important for people to understand that. I think also customized employment can be really valuable for people on the autism spectrum. I think carving jobs out that really focus on people's skills or, looking at specific tasks that they can perform can be really valuable, both for the employee and the employer. At the same time, it's important to recognize that everybody needs some variety in their work. And, while people tend to they can be really focused, I think over time, people on the autism spectrum can really perform well in jobs that require a lot of different skills and require them to do a lot of different tasks.
Yeah, I've noticed more recently a lot more news stories of employers that are recognizing and actually seeking out people on the autism spectrum, given what you said, Alan, that they do have, specific talents and attributes that they find really helpful.
Especially given the workforce shortage.
That's true. Yeah.
I think that's really a good point, Nicole. And
yeah, like when I went to the Anchor conference, people talked about, can we acknowledge that, closing off immigrants is what's causing this DSP crisis. Direct support provider crisis.
Yeah.
Have high expectations, embrace dignity of risk, presume competence, don't assume what a person can or cannot do.
Thank you. So what have you found to be the most challenging aspect of supporting folks on the autism spectrum in employment?
I think one of the biggest obstacles are some of the assumptions that people bring into it. And those assumptions are things like people need to work alone, that they have difficulty working around other people. The assumption that people are going to require a lot of extra training and support. And some people certainly are going to require a lot of extra training and maybe some additional support from VR or from an agency. But I think we often find that people don't need, require about as much training as other people do. Of course, that's not always the case. But yeah, I think the attitudes about what autism is and the assumptions people make and where they go with that. Often, they may have somebody working in isolation, doing the same task over and over again. And it's important to recognize, the great diversity that exists within the autism spectrum.
Not everybody just wants to stuff envelopes.
Right.
Good point. Yeah.
Lack of, other barriers, lack of job coaching, lack of home and community-based services for people who don't have intellectual disability. Like in my case, VR doesn't provide support beyond 90 days.
Mhm. And sometimes people need that support that goes beyond. 90 days.
Transportation.
Yeah.
Then of course you got public benefit fears.
Mhm.
When you bring in family dynamics.
Mhm.
One thing I've noticed is just sort of the role of kind of self-disclosure in terms of employment support. Can you address that in just terms of how you might disclose or what you need to say or what an employer might need to know?
Just tell them, you're on the autism spectrum, you have a disability, talk about your support needs. And if need be, do it with a job coach or VR counselor or a support person to help with negotiating accommodations.
Mhm.
And I think that a lot of people I've known have been at times very reluctant to self-disclose. They're afraid that people are going to think badly of them because they say they have autism.
Stigma.
And one of the problems is that when people are reluctant to do that, one of the advantages is that people aren't bringing their preconceptions about what autism is into the work setting. But at the same time, it's tough for people to get the accommodations they need. I mean, I think of one young man I knew who went to college, and he decided, I'm not going to tell people, I have autism. And he didn't get the accommodations he needed, and he really struggled his freshman year. But after that, when he did disclose and he got the supports that he needed and the accommodations that he needed, he did really well. And ultimately went on to have a very successful career.
And that's definitely going to be important as we, especially going forward, as we figure out whatever this new normal is. Like I know people that are, already being told, oh, you can't stay remote. You need to go back to an office. And I know one person who's fighting that vocally.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thanks for addressing that, and I like the way you phrase that too. That
Yeah, because
support
when we
needed.
look at return to normal, if it excludes people with disabilities,
But phrasing it up, having support needs and accommodations, it's not so much about the disability. And I've seen that with other just sort of invisible disabilities, is sometimes there's a reluctance to disclose, but then they're not going to get their support needs met.
And there's the stigma of, oh, what is so-and-so going to think of me if I say, oh, I'm autistic?
Yeah.
Even though autism is slowly becoming to have less stigma than, say, bipolar.
Yeah, so I
Coming
think it
from a
makes sense.
family with a history of mental health issues where it's always been something hush hush. We don't talk about that.
Yeah.
And if this pandemic, makes anything clear, it's time for disability and mental health to stop being a hush hush, shove it under the rug type topic.
Yeah, and I think things like, we just got through, April was Autism either Awareness or Acceptance Month. And I think it's just getting a lot more attention, people learning more about it. So, I think it's becoming less stigmatizing and people are more open to self-disclose, because I'm just a firm believer in, in self-disclosing, in order to get those support needs. And like you're an example, Alan, if they're not disclosing and they have those needs, they're not going to get met and they're not going to be successful.
Yeah. I think it's true. And Nicole, you brought that up about stigma. I think stigma around autism is really decreasing. I remember when family members, the last thing they'd want to hear is their child had a diagnosis of autism. And
Yeah,
that's,
nowadays, we don't think of it as like, when I first got diagnosed with autism at 21, I thought, okay, that's a boy thing. Okay, somebody flapping, banging their head against the wall. That's the first thing that came to mind when I first heard that word. I'm like, isn't that a boy disability? Not a girl thing. And then it's like, and then slowly during my 20s, during the job corps where I got, I started, reading up and I'm like, wow, this actually makes sense.
Yeah.
When I look back at mild MR and every other diagnosis, that never really made sense.
Thanks. Okay. So what's one piece of advice you would give to employers to help them to be more supportive?
Provide job coaching, provide extra support. Like if we're in the nonprofit world, editing documents, help with editing, editing PowerPoints, that's one thing area where in my case, a lot of support in.
But what would you
Yeah.
like employers to know? What advice would you give employers, Nicole?
Hiring people with autism and other disabilities is worth it. We will reduce your hiring and training costs, lower turnover. Diversity is what makes the world great. Honesty, dependability, productivity, the ability to narrow focus, just focus on the task at hand and not worry about all the other nonsense and goofing
Thanks.
off and all that.
Thanks, Alan. What advice would you give?
I think it's important to understand what kind of supports work generally for people on the autism spectrum. But I also think, and probably more importantly, it's important to understand specifically what kind of supports work for an individual employee and what kind of environment does the person thrive in.
Person-centered. Employment support needs to be person-centered. It's not, okay, you fit the system, the system needs to fit you.
I think
what's best for you.
I think in general, again, I emphasize in general because there's always exceptions. People on the autism spectrum are incredibly diverse, but I think in general, it's important to be very direct and concrete in your communication with an employee. I think it's really good to use schedules and organizers to help the person.
Structure, predictability.
Yeah.
Be calm, cool, collected. When it comes to management styles, especially, with dealing with anxiety, uncertainty, like, the world we're currently in. Being somebody who can help somebody calm down when chaos occurs.
I think it's really important. Another thing I think it's really important for employers to know is that, sometimes people don't do so well with downtime. So it's important to help the person understand what to do, if there's downtime, if they're not busy at any given moment. And I think in general, I think, understanding the kind of environment that's going to work best for a person. A person might have particular sensory needs, or they may overreact to certain sensory stimuli, sounds, or things that they see, and that can really get in the way of a person being successful and being comfortable on a job. And it may look as though the person isn't motivated, or they're not listening, they're not paying attention. In fact, it can be those sensory things can be overwhelming and make it really difficult for the person to succeed.
Yeah, when we talk about supported employment, the first part of that is that discovery process of really getting to know the person. And what we talk about is the ideal conditions of employment and sort of what is the best environment for that person. I know in my training, we use a video with the University of North Carolina speech program, and they talk about just sort of structuring the workplace. And they have some great examples of, like, one young man who just didn't like being around, close to other people. And so they sort of physically, set the, workplace up so that people wouldn't get too close to him, just sort of had some physical barrier. So, once they did that, it was successful for him.
I mean, when figure out, the environment, a person is more or less disabled based on their interaction within the environment. Like, some people may, thrive, okay, being out in the back room, others, maybe interfacing with the public.
Right, exactly.
Like my sister who works in retail, she's, often, when it comes to produce, she's in the back.
So what's one piece of advice you would give people on the autism spectrum in terms of helping them to navigate employment?
Dream big, go for your dreams, find allies who support you. Take advantage of post-secondary education programs like Think College, Succeed program, the LEND program, Leadership Education, Neurodevelopmental Disabilities, funded by Autism Cares Act. Do informational interviews, go to conferences, network, be a broken record.
Mhm.
Especially networking, especially, find people who can, figure out ways to, get you into the back door. Especially when you factor in, interviewing isn't always, the most ideal. We often do better, okay, here's a list of, okay, articles selling your work samples. Here, toolkit on this, toolkit on that.
Mhm. Yeah, Nicole, you mentioned interviewing, and I know more people are using kind of the concept of video resumes because they might not really interview well, but then they can videotape them doing certain jobs and tasks and kind of, showing, rather than telling, what their skills are.
Soft skills are often more challenging for us compared to hard skills.
I think the one piece of advice I would give is to, and this is maybe more than one piece of advice.
That's okay.
Trying to pull a few things in here, but I think it's important to look at the environment for different jobs. Is it sensory friendly? But I think first it's important to recognize what your skills are and what your needs are and what might be a good job match for you. And it's important to look at, the sensory characteristics of the job, what kind of skills are needed, what kind of skills you need to learn to do it. And I think it's really helpful to do that with other people. Brian, you mentioned the discovery process. I think person-centered planning, we had a project that we called family-centered transition planning, where we had a series of person-centered planning meetings. And I think getting a lot of people together who know a person well and know what kind of supports they need, what works for them in different environments can be really valuable. And we know, just building on existing relationships can be really helpful in the job process. That, when we get people together and we talk about possibilities, people know people who, they may be able to contact and help them get a job. I think of one person in particular who was in our transition project. We had a person-centered planning meeting and we were talking about job possibilities, and he was very interested in cooking. And we identified a local college that had a great program, a food service program, and he was able to get a paid internship with them. And it all came about as, a group of people who cared about the person and who knew the person well, got together and thought about, where can this person find a job or get experience in a job that is going to be, that's going to really work for him. I think of another person who, his high school friends came to him and said, we're working for this company, we think you would be good there. And he went and found a job and found it himself. So I guess the big thing is for me is, working as a team, working with family members, working with friends, working with professionals to really come up with a job match that's going to work for the person.
I definitely agree with that. I've been a participant in, person-centered planning processes like MAPS and things like that. And you're right, the team is so valuable, because if it's just you, you only have your perspective. But then you gather your family and friends and people know you well, they can really add to that. And, I agree, there's a lot of value in that process. What aspect of supporting employment do you think employers would find most surprising or informative?
I can jump in, Nicole, unless you want
Yeah,
to.
go for it. Yeah, you
Okay.
can go answer that first.
I think, in addition to the fact that people on the autism spectrum can be great employees, which I think a lot of people don't necessarily understand to begin with. I think one of the things that people may find surprising is that people on the autism spectrum can participate fully in the social life of the workplace, or they can often do that. There's a tendency for people to think that people with autism need to work alone or need to work in isolation. And I think, we really need to figure out what kind of supports work for the person so that they can interact with their coworkers.
And feel like they belong.
Yeah, and because we know that one of the biggest,
Belonging is not the same as inclusion.
one of the things that gets in the way of successful employment, often for people on the autism spectrum, is difficulties with social interaction. And, I think we've often tried to teach those skills, and, that can be really helpful on the job, especially if we focus on those specific social skills that a person needs to learn at that job and to understand the workplace culture. I think that's really important. We can tell people, these are the rules, and people often do well when things are put in terms of rules and they understand, this is exactly what I'm supposed to do in this situation. So I think teaching those skills can be really important. But I think also we need to focus on the social environment itself and not just the person. I think, finding people who can be mentors for the person, especially, that can be a mentor around specific job skills, and it can be a
task,
mentor.
somebody who can be a natural support.
Yeah, oh yeah, exactly. A natural support who can, help the person navigate the social environment and, learn to give the person, useful feedback. And I think that's where VR support agencies can come in. They can work with people and they can work with employers to help them develop the skills that they need to support successful interaction.
Yeah. Nicole, anything to add on that?
That, take part in self-advocacy groups, self-advocacy organizations, peer-run employment programs, where you can learn basic skills, how to be assertive in the workplace, like the higher up curriculum, peer mentoring, finding role models.
So, Nicole, what do you think people who do hire people on the autism spectrum, what do you think they would find most surprising once they hire someone?
Really, hyper focus, people can, hyper focus, narrow focus, boom.
Yeah.
That honesty.
Yeah.
Hardworking, punctuality. Like me, I'm the exact opposite. My sister Megan is always late all the time, and me, I'm Miss Punctuality.
Employers like
I'm
that.
always the one, like if there's a hill visit, I'm always like the first one. Okay, there. When you look at, some of the tier, you look at every DBS, okay, hill visit here. I'm always the, okay, And I'm always like, okay, leave an hour and a half, if one has to take public transit, leave an hour and a half, get there, the whatever policy meeting before everyone else.
I'm the same way, Nicole. I
To be
can't,
early is to be on time is the slogan down here.
being late, the possibility of being late makes me really anxious. So
Same here.
I'm with you.
Like for example, with like my sister Megan, and she's always, late to work, late to everything, and she's always like, and I'm like, come on, Meg, chop chop, let's go, let's get out of here, quit fooling around, enough of the makeup. And my
Yeah.
sister Megan is somebody who's shy, she's socially anxious, she's had depression, anxiety during her high school years. You look at her, both of us were like the exact opposite in some ways.
In my experience, what I think employers find surprising is, initially they might have some skepticism about hiring somebody with a disability, but once they do, I think they're often maybe surprised that they can be a good worker. But I think what surprises them most is just sort of the value added that they bring to the workplace, because they bring their own personality, characteristics, and things like that. And that's one of the things
And sometimes we come with our own health insurance, Medicaid buy-in.
Yeah, right. But I think employers, find that surprising that it really just adds to the workplace in many ways, besides just their productivity.
We're not asking the employer to be charitable when
Right.
we ask them to hire a person.
Yep.
And diversity is great for business. It can boost productivity and boost your bottom line,
That's right. Yeah.
especially nowadays with all the shortages.
And I think the organization is SAG, and I've gotten to know some people from there in the last year. It's a large multinational corporation that does like cloud-based I don't know, technology, and they've decided to that having a diverse workforce is really going to strengthen their company, and part of that diversity is neurodiversity, and they have a lot of people on the autism spectrum who they've hired, and it really benefits their organization pretty dramatically.
That's great. Yeah. More companies need to know that.
Mhm.
All right. Well, any final words as we finish up here, Nicole?
The whole embrace autism. Autism is amazingly unique, totally interesting, sometimes mysterious.
Well said.
Diversity is great for business. And it's important nowadays, as with all this talk about diversity, equity, inclusion, that autism and disability be at the table, especially in the nonprofit social service sector.
You're exactly right.
Provider agencies should be hiring people with disabilities as peer mentors.
Great, thank you. Alan, any departing words?
I've always been amazed in situations I've been involved with where how successful people have been, with just a little bit of support usually. Some people require more ongoing and intense supports, but
when you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism.
Yeah. And
we're not a puzzle, we're not a puzzle piece to be solved, even though many of us, at times may think in puzzles. We can predict trends, honesty, predicting trends, like, for instance, like I've, predicted, all like, I've like when CDC guidance, made decisions to like roll back mask mandate, I've predicted, seeing the trend that I can predict, okay, that's going to result in this surge, that surge. Told you that was coming.
Yeah. So I think that's a really good example of, someone on the autism spectrum bringing some, needed skills to a job, and valuable skills. And, we just, more employers need to learn just how valuable that employees on the autism spectrum can be to their businesses.
Great. I agree. Well, thank you both for the amazing training that you did for us and for this podcast.
How was all the feedback that you got?
It's been very good. So thank you both so much.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Take care.
Adios.
Bye, Brian. Bye, Nicole.
Bye.